Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tuesdays for Teachers. Here we are, November, getting close to the end of the school year, and you are back with us one more time, focusing in on GED knowledge and skill gaps in math. This is session 2 of a two-part series for this. We will have more coming in the months to come in other contact areas, but we're really glad to have you with us today. Before we get started, before I make introductions, just a couple of items. You can see on the screen, there's a sample control panel. Now, we've had a few people who will say to us that, well, mine doesn't look exactly like this, but you should have something very similar. Audio, you can see the link there for that. And you can see that underneath it, there are two options. There's computer audio as well as phone call. So you can switch between them. If for some reason you're hearing us fine now through your computer audio, but you lose that audio at some point, you can switch over to the phone call. The other thing that we do is throughout the session, people are always asking questions. And we have people here today who are going to be answering those questions. And what you'll need to do is, if you'll see down in the, again, in the control panel, you'll see where it says questions and there's a little green arrow next to it. If you'll notice, there's another arrow in that row itself, and it's pointing to a section where you can actually kind of disconnect that question box so you have more space to write. But we have people who will be answering questions. Today, we don't have any handouts listed in there, so you don't have to worry about that. All of our questions will be going through the question box. We don't use the chat during our Tuesdays for Teachers sessions. So hopefully all of you will be able to follow along. And as always, this session is being recorded. It will be posted on GED.com as part of the professional development resources and the webinar archives. So give us a couple of days and that will be posted for you. So today we have several different people with us. Debbie Fawcett, unfortunately, is not able to be with us today. However, we do have Cheryl Clark Trim, who is with us. She is the manager of test development. And we also have Michael Bell, who is a senior content specialist, and he is the one to answer all those math questions you have because his whole focus is math. Also with us today, we have Martin Kay, who is with us, and he's, well, everybody knows Marty in terms of what all he does, but in test development and working throughout to make sure that that GED test is everything that we want it to be for our students. My name is Susan Pittman. I'm fortunate to be an educational consultant who works with the GED testing service, and especially here with Tuesdays for Teachers. We have one person, no pictures is up there, but we couldn't get along without her, and that is Tico Henry. Tico takes care of our technology and is the one who answers all those questions when you say, I can't find this or whatever. You ask the questions and Tico's out there watching to help and respond to all of those different things. So we are so glad to have all of you with us. And we have a lot of content to cover. Now, one thing I want to mention up front, most of you probably were with us for the math part 1, which was delivered in October. However, if you were not there, you didn't have that opportunity, please make sure that you go out. You can see that the actual URL is listed on this particular slide, but it is already archived there in the webinar trainings. And you'll notice there's everything from the PowerPoint to the video where you can watch and learn all these different things, as well as a lot of other resources. Also note, it says download certificate. So just like with that one, there will also be the same type of posting for this webinar. And you'll be able to download a certificate, sign it, and use that to give to your supervisor to let them know that, yes, you are participating in professional development as we're going on. So part 1 is already archived. Part 2 will be there in just a couple of days. So, and we will refer to this again later on within this session. So having said that, I'm going to turn it over to our expert in residence, and that is Michael Bell. And Michael, you're on.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. Susan, I'm actually going to ask a question of you before we begin because I didn't think of it beforehand. You said that part 1 was archived and they can watch the recording. Can they also get to the handouts from part 1?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you look at this particular slide, all of these are links, and those links go directly to all of the handouts. So everything is there, and they'll be able to access that. We keep those, and please, for many people out there, be aware that we archive the webinars, the Tuesdays for Teachers, and if you want to go back and take a look at some of the others we've had along the way, there is a whole list of different ones that we have. Good question, Michael. Thank you for asking that. And yes, we will include the same thing with this.
Right. Well, I bring it up because the handouts aren't essential to following along with my presentation, but you know, questions could come up that we don't have time to answer, and most of them can be found on those handouts. I'm going to reference the assessment framework, the formula sheet, etc. So thank you, Susan.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining. For those of you that were here in part 1, I'm going to try real hard not to duplicate a lot of the material, but I do need to talk a little bit about some of the things for those of us who were not here last month. And the most important thing is the beginning point. Why are we here? What's our focus? And what we've discovered at GED is that some test takers and students have gaps in their knowledge and skills, what they need to succeed and pass the GED math test. Test takers and students may need more coverage and practice in these areas during test preparation. What I'm going to do today is continue what I did in October and tell you some more of the gaps that we found, some of the issues we found. We're not going to dive deep into solutions because you're all teachers, you're all professionals, you all know the best way to teach, and I will not, as a former teacher, insult anybody's intelligence by telling them this is how you should teach. That's just not in my genetic makeup. Next slide, please, Susan. Thank you. Here's what we'll be covering today. It's a little different than last month. Last month, I did cover a little bit about item development and test construction, what we do at GED, how we develop new items, how we put tests together. So if you're interested, by all means, go back to last month's presentation and watch the recording. Tico, is that my feedback?
It is, but now it sounds like it's fixed again. It was just for a moment.
Okay, good. I'm a Neil Ludd. I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing something wrong. Yeah, so if you're interested in those areas, you can go back and watch last month's recording. Mostly what we'll be doing today is, as I said, talking about the gaps and skills, gaps in knowledge and skills that we've identified, with a little background info to set the stage. Next slide, please. Now, here's something that we won't be covering. When I talk about gaps in skills and knowledge, what I'm really talking about are areas where test takers are underperforming to expectations, to previous results, etc. Some concepts, that's not the case. Permutations, quadratic equations, you all know from your students that those are difficult concepts. The items that assess them are going to be difficult, and we expect that. Similarly, if there are things that are, if there are concepts that are fairly easy and the test takers are doing quite successfully on those concepts, we're not going to cover those either. We're just talking about the low-hanging fruit where hopefully your students can get their knowledge up in a few key areas, and maybe that will make the difference between a pass and a no pass. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, this was not in the previous presentation. I did not receive it until afterwards, of course. But we have been tracking at GED a number of test takers. It's actually probably closer to 80,000 by now, who have passed the test for 3 of the 4 subject areas. You can see that math is far and away the one that most of these 80,000 test takers have not done. I'm not going to dive deeply into this. It would just take far too long. That's not why we're here. But the reasons range from test takers who are just barely below the passing score to some who may be beset by math anxiety and have not done anything that we can see to get ready for the math test. They haven't tried it. They haven't taken the GED Ready. You know, we don't know why they've done 3 out of 4 and, you know, not gone on to try math. That's a small number of students, but it's still enough that it is an area of concern. Next slide, please. Thank you. This test was also from last session, where after we developed items and after we did test construction, we field test the items where they're embedded in the operational test. So test takers actually answer those items. We get the results back and we analyze them both statistically and for content issues to make sure that we didn't do something inadvertently to skew the results. We then either accept the item as it is, we reject the item for one of a number of reasons, or we find that it's not good enough to be accepted, but we do know how to fix it, so we'll revise it and then we'll put it back in the field test pool. The key part of this is where we have identified the knowledge and skill gaps that we're going to talk about the rest of today, and that eventually in 2022, the other content areas, I believe, will be taking their turn. Next slide, please, Susan. These are the areas of interest we're going to be covering. Session 1, we only did 3 because we were also talking about some other things. We did non-calculator items, we did exponents and roots, and we did 3-dimensional shapes. For session 2, I had originally scheduled 4 subjects, not thinking I would have time for 5, but after session 1 and after the last data analysis, I've added in compound probability, which is only in blue because this is different than what I said we were going to do in session 1. The important note, and this happened in session 1 and it's going to happen again today, is that sometimes there will be overlap between some of these areas. Those of you who were here last time, remember that exponents and roots are also non-calculator items. Okay, I think the next slide, we actually start talking about gaps. And I forgot to mention, Susan, if you need to interrupt, yes, if you need to interrupt me with a question from the audience at any point, just please do so. Don't worry about, talking over me, because I just tend to kind of ramble. So, all right.
No problem, Michael. If
Can-
things come in, we will make sure that you know it.
Awesome. Excuse me. Okay, gap 4, continuing from gaps 1, 2, 3 from the October session, is compound probability, which is an indicator Q8B. And this is where I call back to the handouts that were given out in the first session in October. There is a copy of the assessment framework, which lists all the indicators and the language thereof. Basically, there's 4 concepts in Q8B, which basically covers all probability on the GED math test. And I'm not going to read them out, but I will call your attention to the asterisk on simple probability, which test takers tend to do fine with that. That means we're not going to cover it here today because there's no need to. And it also explains why I put compound in parentheses at the top of the slide. So we're going to look at some examples for each of these gaps and discuss them briefly. So Susan, if you could, the next slide, please. Okay, here's the first 2 examples. The first one is sequential events. A coin is flipped 3 times. What's the probability that the result is heads each time? I'm not going to answer these, we didn't give multiple choice. That would have just made this presentation 3 times as long at least. And then there's an example of what I realized this morning when I was practicing. Instead of multiple categories, I probably should have put simultaneous events, because that's really a better descriptor, where Amy flips a coin and rolls a standard die, and then you have to find the probability of heads and a 3. And as I'm sure you all know, this is basically taking each event separately, finding the probability, and then multiplying those probabilities together. These 2 aren't terribly problematic, but they're also in here to kind of set the stage for what comes next. Susan, if you would. Okay, I'm not going to read this, but I will call out the 3rd sentence, excuse me. Martin randomly selects a piece of candy from the bag, puts it back, then randomly selects another. This is an item dealing with replacement, in which the probability is calculated out of that total of 20 each time, and again is multiplied. Next one, please, Susan. And then there are items where there is no replacement, where in this case, an employee takes 1 goldfish out of a tank and then another goldfish out of the tank. The key being that instead of 10 goldfish the second time, there are 9. And I know I'm stating the obvious here, and I hope no one's intelligence is insulted. But the bigger point I'm trying to make here is that these are all fairly similar mathematical processes for each of these examples. They all involve finding the probability of simple events. They all involve multiplication, but they're just different enough that we find test takers sometimes have difficulty in distinguishing which process they should use with which situation that an item contains. So it's not only a situation of, oh, they have problems with no replacement, or they have problems with sequential events. It's really a bigger problem of recognizing the situation and then applying the appropriate strategy. All right, let's move on to gap 5.
Michael, if I could, just a quick comment on this particular one and what you were just saying, because I've just often found in working with students that sometimes they're just not careful readers going through this. And so I think that's also a part of what I've seen in the past with students where maybe they're expecting to see something and they just read right on through it.
Wow, Susan, you just brought up an incredibly important point that in my 20+ years of assessment, I have always internalized, and it is just so second nature to me that I did not even think to include it in either one of our presentations. And that is that we don't want this to be a reading test. Word problems should be short, succinct, to the point, but contain enough information that it's obvious to a student who can parse through what needs to be done, what the correct solution method is. And there's always a balance between, can I make this shorter, or does that make it, that just remove too much information? So that's also a good point. Unfortunately, there's no way to remove reading entirely from the test, and I am actually making a note to address this in if I do a similar thing in the future, to make sure that I address reading.
Okay,
But
thank you,
are
Mike.
just absolutely
I appreciate that.
common. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Gap 5 is what we call algebraic computation, as opposed to arithmetic, which just involves numbers. It's basically contained in 3 indicators: A1, D, and F. And I've listed what each one covers, and you'll notice that A1A covers linear expressions while A1D covers polynomials. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, we will explain that. The skills are pretty much the 4 basic operations. There's adding and subtracting, there's multiplying and dividing, there's items that you have to do more than one of those, 2 or 3 or 4. And then there are 2 types of factoring, one involving greatest common factor and one involving trinomials. So next slide, please. Okay, so here's just some quick definitions on the difference between linear expressions and polynomials. One thing I really should have done was on polynomials, I should have included an example that has a constant, because they both, I only concentrated on the differences. I should have included that both of these types can include constants. The -8 in the example under linear expressions is a constant. I could easily put a -8 in either of the polynomial examples, or a +4, or a -2.3896. But we generally just do, well, let me back up. Linear expressions are subsumed under polynomials. They're a type of polynomial, but we generally make a distinction between the two types on the test. And that is down to the way that the framework is written. Next slide, please, Susan. So here are some examples with algebraic computation. Most of the time, like I would say 90 to 95% of our items, we do not do word problems with algebraic computation. Too often the context is forced, it's not realistic, it detracts from what we're asking the students to do. These examples right here, for algebraic computation, this is what your students and our test takers are going to see. This didn't come up until now, but for those of you who weren't in session 1 last month, excuse me, the indicator for each item is written underneath the item in parentheses in smaller type. Because these are linear expressions, they all say A.1.A. First two are very straightforward. The third one is an example both of distributive property in the first term, or I'm sorry, the first set of parentheses, which is a form of multiplication. And it also involves subtracting. So this is an example of the multiple operations that I was talking about. The factoring for linear expressions is always going to be numerical because there's no common variable factor. When you look at 6x and 10y, you can factor out a 2 from each of those coefficients, but the two terms, the 6x and the 10y, they don't have any variables in common. So all they could factor out of that is a 2 as the greatest common factor. Next slide, please, Susan. Okay, here's some more examples with polynomials. You'll notice that they are remarkably similar because the skills themselves are essentially the same. It's just the type of item that, type of expression that is different. I will call your attention, although I'm sure many of you had noticed, to the first item where in the first set of parentheses we have a 3y squared, but in the second parentheses we have an 8y. Test takers have to know what they can combine and what they can't. This is not a trick question. We're not trying to trick students. We're testing whether they recognize that essential fact of computation. Combining like terms has certain rules, and test takers need to know that when they roll in to start the math test. The second example, again, is distributive property, just with exponents and 3 terms inside the parentheses instead of 2. Even though 2 is fairly standard when you're teaching and learning the distributive property, and it's certainly the most common, sometimes there will be 3 terms inside of parentheses. We don't go 4 because really, what's the point? If they can do 2, if they can do 3, then they're certainly going to be able to do 4, and we don't really need to make things, make items that take longer to compute just to prove a point that really does not need proving. The two factor items. The first one, again, similar to the one on the previous page, we can pull a 2 out of both of those coefficients, but this time we do have variables in common. We can pull a single x out of each term, and we can pull a y squared out of each term, so that the greatest common factor is 6x squared, and then multiplied by whatever is left out of each term. The other kind of factoring that you will see for polynomials is when we have a trinomial that has no common factors, and you have to factor it back into two multiplied binomials. Can you actually go back to the last page, Susan?
Sure.
So that 3x squared minus 8x minus 35 gets factored to something like that second example, where you have two binomials multiplied by each other. We're not going to tell, okay, thank you. You can go back to the other one. These aren't exact operational test items, but the directions are pretty much the same for computation. We don't do much more than tell them to subtract, which honestly, it's got a subtraction sign. They might, most of them probably don't even need to be told to subtract, but we do that anyway, or to multiply in the case of the second example. When we say factor, or sometimes we'll say factor completely, we're not telling them whether it is greatest common factor or factoring to two binomials. Again, that's knowledge that they need to have and recognize the different types when they walk in to take the test. I think that's it on this slide. Next slide, please, Susan.
Okay, I'm looking to see here, we have a question about why you're calling them linear expressions. When you multiply two binomials, it would be a variable to a power of 2. So
Okay,
can you expand a little bit on that for us?
I can, and I'm going to start by congratulating Velma for asking an excellent question. Basically, we know what linear equations are. Linear expressions is just a way to describe expressions that do not have exponents and do not have variables multiplied together. So it could be something like this first parentheses. You know what? I'm pointing at the screen like you can all see me. I still do that. 2n minus 3. So just one variable, no exponent. That's an example. 5x minus 3y in the next one is another example. That's the thing with mathematical terminology is some things are standard, like equation. There's only really one definition for an equation, or a linear equation, or a quadratic equation. Some things there may be more than one term for it. So it may be that there is another term for linear expression that I just have never come across. I have honestly had that happen before, and I thought someone was just pulling my leg, making stuff up. I got my mathematical dictionary, and it's like, nope, that's a real term that people use, and I had never heard it before. You especially see this if you go to other English-speaking countries. Australia has, I wish I could remember the word for exponent that they use, but it was something that I had never heard before. Now, to the second point of your question, Velma, You're absolutely correct. When you multiply these two, the result will not be linear. That's not the point of the indicator. The point of the indicator is it involves what are you starting with. So you're starting with linear expressions like 5x minus 3y, or x plus 4y, or 6x plus 10y. What you end up with might involve exponents. I'm just checking over the rest of your question to make sure I didn't. Why is he calling it one? Yeah. Yes. And when I glossed over this part when I was reading it originally. You're right. All of these variables do have exponents. It's a power of 1. It's just not written. So that was a little bit inexact of me to say it that way. So again, thank you for making that important distinction. Okay, I hope that answers all of your questions. And believe me, Marty and Cheryl, as my bosses, will back me up. There's nothing I love more than talking math, but I have to move on. So if you have another question, by all means, type it in. And I swear I will try my best to get to it. Okay, let me find my place. Okay, inequalities. I got to share this with you, everybody. This was the one that shocked me the most when I was doing the data analysis. As you can see, we assess equations, which is indicators that start A.2. But they do less well on inequalities. And it's not just a little bit, it's enough that we count it as significant, even though nearly all the concepts are practically identical. If you compare what is covered on the GED, in those 3 bullet points, solving equations and inequalities algebraically, isolating the variable, inverse operations, they're again almost identical. Using algebraic reasoning to solve contextual problems, and we'll see an example of that will, it's easier to show than to explain. Those are essentially, again, identical. Writing equations and inequalities, and I really should have added to model context. Again, nearly identical. The largest difference, of course, is the way that they're graphed. Graphing inequalities is done on a number line and equations are done on a coordinate grid, but we all knew that. So yeah, I was very surprised when I saw this one, but numbers don't lie. So if you could give us the next slide, please, Susan. Okay. This is one where I had to really think about, okay, where are the differences that are causing test takers to not do terribly well on inequalities? And these are the differences that I came up with. Now, I'm not going to read through them all, but those first 2 bullet points, we don't specifically assess that. We don't have test items that ask about what is the meaning of inequality, what is the vocabulary of inequality, what does it mean less than or more than or equals or what have you. But if test takers don't understand the meaning, if they don't know the vocabulary, if they don't know the symbols, it is going to be so much harder for them when they start taking that test. On a purely mechanical basis, those last 2 seem to be where a lot of the problem lies. Knowing when to switch direction when they're solving and identifying the graph. Oh, I love that picture. Well, it's not the blue screen of death. There we go. Okay. It's okay. I love it. Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Next
My
slide.
apologies, but my keyboard decided to cut out.
You know, I believe we're legally required to have at least one technological glitch presentation. So
Thank you.
I'm glad we got it out. Okay. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through, for each of the 4 indicators, we're going to go through that cover inequalities. We're going to go through one example just so you see what it looks like. So for A3A, it's solving an inequality. That's it. Here's an inequality, solve it. And, you know, I put a -4x in there just because, well, they got 2 ways to deal with it. They can move it over to the right side so they don't have to divide by the negative. Or they got to remember that when they divide by a negative, they have to switch the direction of the equal sign. That's what I love about math. There's almost always more than one way to solve the problem. For A3B, it's similar. This is a 3-step inequality to solve. Not all of them are 3 steps because we don't want to get it too complex when really the focus is not so much on the solving, it's on mapping. And what the test taker would have underneath this, if this were a multiple choice item, is they would have 4 different number line graphs, and they Next slide, please. We see the first example. This is what I was
Michael,
saying.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a minute. We have some background noise that's coming in. I'm not sure if we have someone on the participant side that is unmuted, but I'm not exactly sure where that one's coming from.
Okay. All right, well, I'll just continue here.
Excuse me. So we have someone who is a phone caller.
Yeah. Can
and
everybody put their lines
if
on
we
mute, please? Everybody, please.
Oh, I didn't realize phone callers.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, folks.
All right. Luckily, I have a script to read through, so I'm not shaking at all. When I started talking about GAP 6 and I mentioned using algebraic reasoning to solve contextual problems, context-based problems, I'm talking about examples exactly like this first one, where there's no equation given, it's a word problem, there's some information given, and they're asked to basically find an answer based on the information given. If you were to, now, if you weren't here in session 1, one of the things I mentioned is that we do not test solution methods. So students and test takers are free to solve this first example by any means that works, that they're comfortable with, even if it comes down to trial and error, although hopefully they, don't have to go that route because it takes longer. But basically, it's a question of, how many jerseys can Sarah afford? Because the answer will come out to be something like 22, or let's see, blah, 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 something like 6.8 or 7.2, and you can't have 0.8 or 0.2 of a jersey, so it comes out to be just 6 or 7 or 10 or whatever it is, depending on the item. One of the popular methods, and I neither endorse it nor condemn it, is for test takers to write an inequality and then solve it. And if they do that, the steps they use in solving the inequality, I hope I said it right, an inequality, not an equation. The steps they take in solving an inequality are pretty much the same steps they're going to use when they're solving this, even if they don't realize it. Again, this is also something that we do in 8.2 with equations where the answers do come out exact, or we come out with something like, 8.2 gallons, because you can have 0.2 of a gallon. You just can't have 0.2 of a jersey. The second example, as you can see, uses the same setup, but instead of asking for a number answer, what we're asking is for them to write an inequality that can model this situation. And that goes back to what I was saying about they have to understand the concepts, the meanings, the symbols of inequality. Otherwise, they're going to be down to guessing or using faulty knowledge when it comes to figuring out which inequality represents that particular situation. Next slide, please, Susan. Okay, slope and graphing are gap 7. And you can make an argument that these are really two different things, and you'd have a valid argument, but they're so closely tied together and related on the GED test. And they're both areas of concern that they've been grouped together here. There are two main indicators, A5B and A5D, and you can see in the parentheses what each one does, or I'm sorry, covers. There are also some related indicators, A5B, which is interpreting unit radius slope, and 8.6A, B, and C, which are purely algebraic manipulation. Here are 2 points on a line. What's the slope or what's the equation of the line? These are difficult indicators, and the success of test takers is about where we expect, but by analyzing what they're doing wrong, it's usually related to the slope. So that's why it's included as a related indicator. Next slide, please, Susan. Thank you. Okay, here's a fairly standard A5B problem. There's 3 points in the table. What is the slope of the line represented by this table? And this is a good point for me to tell you, for those of you that weren't here in session 1, the formula sheet is one of the, I think it was one of the handouts. Susan, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that when I'm done with this. But the important thing is the slope formula is on the formula sheet that every student has available to them. There's a button when they're taking the test. If they need to look up a formula, they click on that button, the formula sheet comes up, they find all the formulas, it's got all the formulas they might need, and they find the one they need, and hopefully they use it and they get the item right. We don't require memorization of formulas. If there's a formula that we use in an item and it's not on the formula sheet, we give it to them in the item. Memorizing formulas is not indicative of, what we're trying to get at with the GED math test. Susan, was the formula sheet, I should have written it down last time, was the formula sheet one of the ones we gave them?
Yes, Michael, we did give them the formula sheet, and we'll make sure that everything like that is duplicated. And the other thing to keep in mind is that after Michael finishes his component, we'll talk about how you access some of those resources on the GED.com website, so that, you know, you may download it and then you forget where you put it. We'll show you where to go back and get it again.
You're so good at what you do, Susan. Next slide, please. Okay, that first example, I don't know why it didn't come out as one line, but that's okay. That's another example of A5B, where we give them an equation and they have to determine the slope. For graphing, let's look at the two examples, the second and third examples. You can see they're basically the same, which graph represents the equation. The difference is the second example, 8x minus 3y equals 24, is written in standard form, while the last example is written in slope-intercept form. We do expect test takers to know how to graph from both of those forms, even if the only way they can do it is by turning standard form into slope-intercept form and then graphing, or vice versa. As long as it works, as long as it's mathematically valid. Again, we don't assess solution methods, but all y'all teachers need to know that your students are going to see both kinds of equations on the test. Maybe not, you know, it might just be one item on a test, but since we give 3 tests on a rotating basis at any one time, they might take one test and see an equation in standard form, and then take another test and see it in slope-intercept form. And, you know, they don't know which one's going to be on there, so it's, you know, they need to be prepared. I will say one thing about this graph in the lower right. That is not there to be the answer to any of those items. It's just there kind of for decoration, reminder. It's also an example of, I also want to mention that we do not do what's called backwards assessment. If you read the text of A.5.D, it basically says, if you have an equation, be able to graph it. That's the way all our items are written. Give an equation, ask to identify the correct graph. We do not go the other way. We would not give a graph, ask which equation matches the graph. That might be a great exercise for the classroom. And in fact, when I taught, it's something that I did. But for the GED, if it's written a certain way, that's the only way your students are going to see it. Next slide, please, Susan, while I take a sip of water. And here we arrive at the final gap, gap 8. Those of you who attended the first session, or even saw me talking about it earlier, you notice that most of these have been about specific mathematical skills, but the first one I mentioned, and the first one I discussed last month, was on a type of item, and that was non-calculator items. There are a few items at the start of the GED test where calculators are not allowed. Test takers have to work it out by themselves without the aid of a calculator. This gap multiple correct answers is one that we've actually known about for quite a while. And it's not skill-based. It has to do with the type of item. And as you can see on there, most of the items on the GED math test are multiple choice. Obviously, a multiple choice item only has one correct answer. When test takers are taking the test, they can only click on one correct answer. But we also have what are called technology enhanced items, which include fill in the blank, drag and drop, hotspot, and drop downs. Most of those also only have one correct answer, but sometimes a TE item might have more than one. And for some reason, this will often give test takers conniption fits. Sometimes they won't see an item like that on the test. Most times if they do, it'll be only one. Rarely there might be two. I don't recall any tests where we had two of that kind, but since I can't be sure, I don't want to rule it out. But it's going to be very rare, but it is something that test takers should be aware of. So, Susan, if we could get to the next slide, I'll show you a couple examples. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more slide first. There's two types of items we're going to look at. There's the type where more than one correct answer is possible, but test takers are only asked to select one. So it's like, okay, it could be A, it could be B. If they choose one of those, they're going to get it right. The second kind of item like this is one where they're asked to select all correct answers. Kind of like classifying, I'm not sure, really should have had a better example prepared. It's a classification item. Is it a correct answer? Is it not a correct answer? Does it fit the criteria? Does it not fit the criteria? And the reason this is skill-based is because an item with multiple correct answer could assess any indicator that it supports the format. Not all of them do. Not all of them are appropriate for this. So I can't tell you, oh, they should be prepared to see it in algebra or geometry or data. But just as a general rule, that occasionally there might be an answer where more than one correct answer is possible. Okay, now the next slide should lead us to the examples. Okay, here we have a table that is not a function, and test takers can click, what we're asking test takers to do, I should say, is click on any pair of numbers to remove so that the rest of the table does represent a function. Obviously, most of you already figured out, they could click on 1,5, and that way all these other four pairs would constitute a function. Or they could click on 1, -8 to remove it, and the other four pairs would then constitute a function. And unfortunately, this is a PowerPoint that's being projected, so I can't actually click on these to show you how it would work. If I clicked on 1,5, that whole rectangle, and again, I'm using my arrow to outline it like you can see it, that whole rectangle would turn blue so that the test taker knows that they successfully clicked on an item or on a coordinate pair. Oh, Susan, you are just amazing. Absolutely, yes. It would also be colored inside. It wouldn't just be the outline, but yeah, exactly. Oh. So that's one way they could do it. Or it would be 1,8. Now this item would be set up, the functionality would be set up that they could only click 1,5 or 1, -8. They only get to click one pair. Also, they could click 0, -2. They could click 4, 0. They could click -3, -3. Those would all be incorrect answers, but they can still click them. If they couldn't, then they'd automatically get it right. And that's really not the point. So that's an example where they only have to click one answer. They only can click one answer, but there's 2 answers that could be right and 3 that could be wrong. Next slide, please, Susan. Okay. We're just going to ignore the yellow. Oh, perfect. Thank you. You are reading my mind, Susan. Okay. These numbers represent slopes of lines on a coordinate grid. And we want test takers to click on the pair or pairs that represent perpendicular slopes. So the bottom left, -1 and 1, and the top right, 1/3 and -3, those are the correct answers. To get this item scored correct, a test taker would have to click on the bottom left. They would have to click on the top right, and that would be it. If they clicked on that one, and then a third one, or a fourth one even, that would be incorrect. If they only clicked on one of the 2 correct answers, that would also be incorrect. This goes back to Susan's excellent comment that she made earlier today about really reading the directions and making sure that they are parsing them correctly, doing what they are asked to do. There are only, out of the 42 items on the GED math test, there's only going to be 4 that are not multiple choice. So this isn't necessarily going to be a deal breaker if they do well enough on all the multiple choice items, but we all know how the bell curve works, and that median of that passing score, there's just so many test takers just to the left of that median score, that passing score, that just they could be just 1 item short or 2 items short. And so again, we've come full circle. We want to make sure that you have all the information that we have, where we've looked at these items. We've figured out where are they underperforming? What are the problems? For this particular gap, multiple correct answers, we actually get a lot of questions from teachers and administrators who have questions. So when Debbie and Susan and my bosses asked me to prepare this presentation, this was the first one that came to mind. Not because it's the biggest problem, but because it's one that seems to be problematic for a lot of test takers and also a fair number of teachers for whatever reason. So that
Michael, we
is
have a question here that comes back specifically to this, and it's, can you explain the reasoning here? Are those points, and does it come with a grid?
No. And it says that the pairs of numbers represent the slopes of lines on a coordinate grid. If they were points, we would put them in parentheses in standard notation.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm trying to find the question to make sure I'm, okay. Yeah, and we do not give a grid for test takers to work on. if they're taking it and I don't know where most of the test takers are doing it now, Cheryl or Marty would have to speak to that. But when the testing centers were the only option before COVID came along, test takers had a whiteboard that they could do all their scratch work on. And I know that some small percentage, I say small, but it's probably close to 30 by now, of our test takers are doing the online test where they're also allowed scratch paper and they can, make their own grid. And so, they could work out, okay, a slope of 1, what would that look like? A slope of -1, what would that look like? Hopefully, though, they would know that perpendicular slopes multiplied to -1, 0 times 1 is 0, -1 times 1 is -1, 1/3 of -3 makes -1, -1/2 and -2 makes 1. So the only two that work out mathematically, if you multiply them, are the bottom left and the top right. I hope that answered all aspects of the question.
I'm looking to see if we have anything. And I think you just explained that. So we have one other, I think in the next slide, we have a question. And Michael, I'm not sure if you are going to be the one to answer this, or Cheryl or whomever, but there's this rumor out there that the GED math test is just getting harder all the time. And I'll be the first to tell you that, having worked with some programs in different states, I am hearing this from some teachers who are hearing it from their students. And the question comes back as, why are my students passing the GED Math Ready test, but they're not passing the GED math test?
Marty, do you want to take that? Yeah, Marty, do you want to take that, or would you like me to respond?
Sure, I just had to get myself off mute. Yeah, so I just first let me say the GED math test is not getting harder. The test is the same as it always has been since 2014. We take great care to make sure that our forms are equivalent in content coverage and difficulty from form to form and from year to year. Everything is equated back to the original test forms that were put together back in 2014, and that this standards are based on the passing standards and so forth. There can be a feeling on the part of students that they can pass the practice test but not the operational test, and frequently that's based on two different things. One is that, remember that the GED Ready gives you you don't really pass it. You get a score of red, green, or yellow. And even if you get in the green zone, if you're just scoring like right around that, the beginning of the green zone, that sort of lowest quote unquote passing score, it's a probability of the likelihood that you'll pass the test. And at that passing score, it's about 70% probability. And so anybody that's stepped out and been surprised by the rain knows that with probability, it's, if 70% probability, 70% of the time, you're going to pass, but there's those other 30% that you might not. And there's a lot of other factors that can go into whether someone passes the operational test. It can be their, nerves about math, or their math anxiety, the fact that the test is longer. Maybe they're not used to, being in a testing situation that long. There's lots of different reasons. But I will also say that we do look at the data from the GED Ready as compared to the operational test. And we see that the relationship between those two tests, the practice and the operational test, are very consistent over time, right? Since 2014 up to date. Overall, when the probability is that when you get in the green zone on the GED Ready, you're very likely to pass the test. It's not a guarantee, you won't always pass, but most people do.
Well, I think, Marty, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep a recording of you saying this equated back to the original 2014 test, because we have heard from a lot of different people. And I know that right now everyone is trying to get back into the swing of things. And, there's so much that's going on. So thank you for taking that on and explaining it to us. And also keep in mind, folks, that, what we do is we try to lay out the best instructional process that we can, and that's a big part of why we've had Michael here today to go through and really talk about maybe some of those places that we're not always hitting hard enough. Maybe we're not covering them as in depth as we should, and we need to kind of kick up our own game as we're going through with all this, and making sure that our students have what they need. And just to keep that in mind, there's just, again, if you missed part one of Michael's presentation, which, covered those non-calculator items and exponents and 3D geometric shapes, you're going to want to take a look at that. And again, it's out there on the GED.com website, so you can go out and pull down all the materials. You can look at the video itself and listen to everything. And the beauty of all this is that, if there's something you want to go back and review, you can certainly do that. Now, Michael mentioned earlier, and I want to reiterate this, we will be posting some of these same resources when we do mathematical reasoning part 2, because they're just as important. The assessment target comparison chart, we'll make sure it's there. That GED study guide, the formula sheet, all of those things that you need to access, so you can come back and pick those different pieces up. But we want to remind you, there are resources that you and your students really need to take advantage of. There's computer tutorial, the calculator tutorial, the calculator reference sheet, all of those different things. I highly recommend that if you are not today encouraging your students to go out to the computer tutorial, that you do. There's an entire section that's on mathematics resources. Excellent part for you to go through. You have the GED test calculator tutorial. Students get nervous when they go in to take that test. And here's the great opportunity for them to go back and look at that reference sheet, practice with the on-screen calculator, especially if they're taking, the online proctor test. And formula sheet, absolutely vital. And as Michael was talking about, otherwise, here's slope of a line. You look at these different algebra formulas that are included here. The slope-intercept, the point-slope form of an equation, the standard form of a quadratic equation, all of those different pieces are there. So keep that in mind, that your students have those and that they use them as well. The Math Study Guide, again, another great resource, just something where you can go through and take a look at some sample questions and have students love to receive things in class. This is a great thing for you to give to them, and they can move through those. You can use them as discussion points, lots of different ways that you can access that. And Michael referenced it here, the calculator prohibited indicators. Please make sure that we're not just tossing out those first 5 questions, that our students are able to handle these types of questions, whether they have a calculator or not. That's just so important as we go through. And now I want to talk just a little bit about some other resources. And one, again, if you are like me, I am a history teacher. That's my background, history major. But I worked in adult ed programs for a long time. And sometimes I have to get myself ready for this because it's been a while since I had an algebra course. Don't forget to use some of these things for yourself as well as for your students. You know, the Khan Academy, they have a great section here on getting ready for Algebra 1. And if you take a look at the different types of things that they have within it, great resource. Another thing you may want to do, learner.org. This is from the Annenberg Foundation. They have incredible videos where students can go through, and this one is all focused on patterns, functions, and algebra. So if we take a look at the different elements that are in there, so many of the things could be useful for us. Now, yes, I know maybe you don't want to do the classroom study K through 12 or K through 2, but you certainly may want to check out grades 6 through 8. And here's another one. This is free. It is from Microsoft. It's called the Microsoft Math Solver. You can download it not only to your PC, but also this comes in a form where you can do it on your phone. And students can input a problem and it will solve it for them and give them the steps. So you can have students who go through and they have a problem they have to solve, or maybe they have something that they have to factor, or they're multiplying binomials. They can do it on paper or they're in the classroom, and then they can load it into their phone and check and see if they have it right. I mean, there's so many things you can do, and it's free. Love this. GED Math Crash Course, great. I'm pointing out two things here that I think will be helpful for you: Algebra Essentials and also Slope and Lines. So you may want to take advantage of that as well. And another one of my favorites, Math is Fun, coming out of the UK. Just watch the different language that they use. And that has an entire section on algebra, but I'm pointing out specifically here, looking at introduction to inequalities and solving inequalities. Michael pointed out it was a surprising big deal for students in how they're working with inequalities. Another thing you may want to do is take a look at Flexbooks from CK through 12. They have a number of different things. Do our students have the vocabulary that they need in order to work with the different things? And one more, it's called the Virtual Nerd. I think you'll find it an interesting tool. Again, lots of videos that students can access. And again, it's all free. So having said that, I will just remind you that our next Tuesdays for Teachers is coming up December 7th, and we will be focusing on language arts. I know we're going to give Michael a little bit of a breather since he's been taking October and November for us. And we'll continue on with other items as we move into the new year. One other thing I just briefly want to say to all of you. We've been talking today about the issues that students are having, those knowledge and skill gaps. And, you know, what people think success looks like is this line is shooting up and everything's just fine. But I think Michael will attest to that sometimes it looks just a little crazy because there are so many different changes and back and forth that we have to do. But our students, they all can be successful with this. So what I'd like to do at this point is I'd like to ask Cheryl and Marty if there are additional questions that we have out there, because I would certainly, while we have Michael here, let's make sure we're getting all those math questions answered.
I'm sorry, I'm responding to a question at the moment. Was there something in particular that you wanted us to
I'm
address?
just asking if there's any specific questions that we have out there that we need to run by Michael?
All right.
I actually was answering a few while Susan was
Okay.
talking.
Thank you, Michael.
I can do two things at once, but that's it. I can't do more than that.
Yeah, so I'll leave it to you, Michael, if you see anything else. There's a couple of comments in there about perpendicular lines, negative reciprocals. I think some people were sort of asking or commenting as you were covering some of the examples. So I don't know the
Yeah.
page that were referenced back to you. I know there was a question on page, I think when we were on page 26. Let me see if I can find that one.
Okay, and I need to ask this question from Andy. Andy says, I have the CCRS standards and am a state leader for them. I've searched the standards and don't find this. Andy, could you expand just a little bit more on that? What exactly we missed in terms of what you're not finding?
Yeah, that's the question I was trying to respond to, and I have it half written, but it's basically I believe, Andy, you were speaking about a slope of perpendicular lines and perhaps questioning why they are, or maybe they're not in the CCRs. And maybe you're questioning why are we covering them? And I would say the short answer to that is that our assessment targets align with the CCRs, but they are not exactly the same. And the reason for that is because we have to align with the vast majority of standards, because this is not just, we don't align just with CCRs, we don't align with just one state. We're trying to cover as much as we can across the United States, across all of the state standards. So there are some differences between what we cover and what you will see in the CCRs. It's not an exact one-to-one match. College and career ready is not a state thing. Okay.
Marty, let me ask you this question, if you don't mind. Andy made a comment as well about maybe the green zone should be at 150 plus instead of at 145. Could you give us a little information from that direction?
Sure. Yeah, so just keep in mind that the zones were set, based on judgment calls that we want to encourage students to move forward when they have the skills, and so we don't want to have students refrain from testing just because there's a possibility that they might not pass. The reality is that as their score increases on GD Ready, the likelihood that they're going to pass the operational test with a score of 145 or higher increases. And so it's just like anything, if someone is just on borderline, they have greater than a 2/3 probability that they'll pass the operational test, but there's always a chance that they wouldn't pass. Just like even if they score really high on GD Ready, there's always a chance that they might not pass based on maybe their nerves or they didn't get enough sleep the night before, or there's just lots of things that can impact somebody's test performance. So we really set those levels in a way that we want to be encouraging to the vast majority of students that when they get in that range, they're really likely to pass the test. And we've looked at that data continually since 2014, and we find that for the vast majority of students, those that having that green start at the 145 is really an effective way. Now, if you are teaching certain students and you feel like you'd like to encourage them to try for a higher score on that, then that's your judgment call. And it's also you're dealing with adults. It's their judgment as to whether they, want to think about, trying for a higher score before they take the operational test. But we found that on balance, it really works out well with these zones the way they're structured. We've got now 7, almost 8 years of experience with this, and the data really bears out at this point.
Okay, and Marty, I think that's from my standpoint and working when I was working in the classroom, you really had to pay attention to what that student was going to do next. And for many of my students, I always encouraged them. I wanted them to go more than the minimum on everything. And so, and especially those students who told me that they wanted to continue on to higher ed. And, we push beyond that. But, I think that we have to look at it in a kind of overall standpoint. And so, Marty brings up a good point to, if you feel like you need to push that, that's certainly something that as a teacher, using your judgment, how you could do that. And we have another one, the question that can a student that passed the GED test with a lower score test again in order for them to get a higher score?
So we would have to know, why do they want to retest? Because once you've passed it, you have, maybe you've mastered that piece of it. It would have to be an exception, perhaps related to college and career readiness status, something like that, that we would have to look at on a case-by-case basis. So it's not something we would normally do or allow.
So it could be a possibility, but not just because I want to. It might be, okay, Arminda says that they want to get scholarships or testing for getting into college. Again, I think you'd have to look at, is there a specific reason why the student would want to do that, correct?
Correct. Yeah, right. They would need to contact us and explain, and we would work with that student to see if there's something we could do to allow them to retest.
Okay.
So it's not something we would offer on a wide scale. It would be on a case-by-case basis.
And if I can just add to that too, just keep in mind that a lot of these policies are set by the individual states that are responsible for issuing the credential that's based on the GED test. And so we would also consult with the state in terms of their policies and what they would allow. We do in fact allow students to retest and get a higher score based on those policies. But as Cheryl has indicated, we do that on a case-by-case basis, and we want to make sure that there's a valid reason for people wanting to retest once they've passed.
There's another question for Michael. Oh, I'm sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Oh, no, well, this is one that I want to make sure that we get this myth kind of out of the way. And Wendy brought this up. Thank you, Wendy. She's heard there's a myth that how a student scores on GED Ready is predictive of the level of test they are given. There's no connection between that, correct?
No, you're right. That is incorrect. There's no level of test, as Marty stated previously. The tests are not, we don't have a set of tests that are easier or harder, that we pick and choose which test takers, which students receive them. The test, let me try to put it just kind of like in layman's terms, so I'm not talking like a psychometrician would talk. The psychometricians and the whole team, we make sure that from year to year, the test forms that are out there, one test is not harder than the test from the previous year. So if you took a test in 2014, you don't have any greater chance of scoring higher or lower than if you took the test today. And if you take the GED Ready, there's no correlation, there's no connection there between any version of the test that you're going to receive. It's random, actually. So no, there is no correlation.
Well, and Cheryl, thank you for that, because I just kind of think of like they're all in a barrel and you just grab one out. And it's whichever one, this is one of those things where sometimes we get these rumors kind of going that, oh, this is done because of this and this because of that. And no, it's just, that's the beauty of the GED test, and the fact that they're so cautious about how they connect everything. So I know that it is 5 now, which is the end of our time. I'll ask Cheryl, any final thoughts?
There is one question that someone has asked a couple of times. I'm not sure if, Michael, you could maybe respond to this person maybe afterwards. It had to do with, I think, the probability and the way the question about flipping the coin was asked. So if you could look and perhaps you could get a response to that person.
And I believe that question was from Andy, and there is his email address is in there. So Michael, if you can take care of that. Michael, do you have some final last thoughts as we get ready to close this down?
Well, I'm going to brag just for a little bit. At least one person said we did an outstanding job. And I took the liberty of, I hope it was more than one person that really thinks that. But I took the liberty of thanking them and saying there is absolutely no way I could have done this without Susan and the unfortunately absent Debbie. So, just to make sure that everyone knows how indispensable you are to these and how much I appreciate the guidance you gave. And I'm very gratified and very hopeful that what we did here today is useful to the teachers and to the students, because that's really why we're here, is because of the students.
Well, Michael, I'm going to say from my standpoint, there were a few times that you might ask me a question. I was a little slow on the muting, and that was because I was taking notes on the PowerPoint, because there was so much good information that was coming out. And, we really appreciate the time that you took to take us through this, to the work that you do every day to make sure that this test is out there. It's, it is a valid test. It is a reliable test. It is a test that our students can count on. And that just means the world to all of us, because we know what this can mean for people as they're heading off into the future. I want to thank Marty for joining us and spending his time today answering questions, because we don't always get a chance to talk with Marty, because he's very, very busy out there. Cheryl, Michael, thank you so much. Tico, thank you for all that you do in keeping us on track. And most of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you who have been with us today, and those of you who have been with us for both the math. Thank you for your passion and your dedication to students and making sure that they're successful as they move on from there. So I'm going to flip one more slide, and if you have questions or concerns, please feel free. You can send it help@ged.com and they'll answer your questions. Debbie Fawcett may not have been with us today. However, she's in the same boat I am. If you send us a question via email, we'll be more than happy to answer it or get it to the right person so it can be answered. So having said that, I want to thank everyone today. Have a great rest of your day and evening, and a good week. So take care, everyone. Bye.